October 1935. In East Africa, columns of Italian soldiers marched through dust and heat, banners bearing the symbol of the new Roman Empire. Benito Mussolini had promised Italians a reborn glory, and the invasion of Ethiopia was his proof. 300,000 men crossed from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland under Marshal Pietro Badoglio and Prince Amedeo di Savoia-Aosta. They fought Emperor Haile Selassie's poorly equipped army with aircraft, tanks, and poison gas. 7 months later, Addis Ababa fell. On the 9th of May 1936, Mussolini declared the birth of Italian East Africa, a single colony uniting Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somaliland, with Amedeo, Duke of Aosta, as its viceroy. The victory looked total, but it masked failure. Ethiopia refused to stay conquered. Italian rule extended only along the roads. Beyond them, guerrillas fought relentlessly. Each garrison pinned down in the highlands drained strength from the empire that Rome claimed was invincible. To hold the new territory, Italy poured in settlers and money. Roads, airfields, and concrete towns appeared across the mountains, all supplied from ports thousands of miles away through the British-controlled Suez Canal. Every crate of food, every gallon of petrol depended on British tolerance. By 1938, Italian officers knew that if London ever closed the sea lanes, the colony would starve. Amedeo warned Rome again and again that an empire built on someone else's shipping lanes was an empire built on sand. Mussolini ignored him. Among his senior officers were men whose names would later mark the end of that same empire. Prince Amedeo himself, calm, dutiful, and respected even by his enemies. General Pietro Gazzera, commander on the Sudanese frontier, more soldier than ideologue. And General Guglielmo Nazi, protector of Eritrea's mountain passes, precise and methodical. They were loyal professionals, not fascist fanatics, and when the crisis came, that difference would decide how each acted. Between 1936 and 1939, while Europe slid toward war, Mussolini's African dream became a burden. Italian troops fought in Spain for Franco, consuming fuel and ammunition that the colonies desperately needed. The Pact of Steel bound Italy to Hitler, guaranteeing that any German war would also be Italy's. In Addis Ababa, Amedeo requested aircraft, anti-tank guns, spare parts. He received none. Rome sent rhetoric instead of supplies. When Germany overran France in 6 weeks, Mussolini saw easy glory. On the 10th of June 1940, he declared war on Britain and France. Within hours, the Suez Canal closed to Italian shipping. All trade across the Red Sea stopped. Italian East Africa, with 500,000 troops and 200 aircraft, was completely isolated from Europe. At first, the news seemed to promise opportunity. Across the border lay thinly defended British territories, Sudan, Kenya, and British Somaliland. If they struck fast, the Italians might seize fuel and food before the blockade strangled them. Rome ordered Amedeo to attack. In August 1940, General Nasi led 25,000 men into British Somaliland. They faced barely 5,000 defenders, British, Indian, and local. After 10 days of hard fighting, the British evacuated through Berbera. It was Italy's only clear victory in Africa during the entire war. Mussolini hailed it as proof that fascism had forged a new warrior race. Amedeo saw something else, a temporary success that stretched his supply lines and invited disaster. By late 1940, the blockade began to choke the colony. Aviation fuel dropped to critical levels. Ammunition was rationed. Factories improvised uniforms from local cotton, repaired trucks with salvaged parts, and brewed alcohol for engine fuel. Soldiers patched aircraft wings with cloth and glue. The self-proclaimed empire had become a besieged island in the desert. Radio contact with Rome faded. British jamming and broken cables left them half-deaf to the outside world. Gazzera later wrote, "We lived as on an island slowly sinking into the sea. Meanwhile, Britain gathered strength. From the Sudan and Kenya came a polyglot army. Sudanese battalions, the King's African Rifles, Indian brigades, South African armoured cars, and Free French troops from Chad. Altogether 250,000 men prepared to retake East Africa. General Sir Archibald Wavell in Cairo coordinated it all. Contain Rommel in Libya, destroy Italy's isolated empire in the east. Inside Addis Ababa headquarters, pessimism replaced pride. Reports described malaria, hunger, and constant ambushes by Ethiopian resistance. Amedeo maintained formality, but privately he questioned the government that had abandoned him. Some subordinates clung to ideology. Others thought only of survival. Gazzera, responsible for the southern frontier with the Belgian Congo, quietly asked neutral diplomats about conditions of internment should surrender ever come. It was prudence, not yet defection, but the thought itself showed how far faith had eroded. From Rome came nothing useful. Messages took weeks, and when replies arrived they repeated slogans, "Hold firm, victory will come." The generals already suspected that Mussolini had written them off. Hitler's attention lay on Egypt and the Mediterranean. East Africa was expendable. By December 1940, Italian soldiers noticed that propaganda bulletins spoke only of the desert war in Libya. Their own struggle vanished from the news. The material balance told the truth. Barely 350 aircraft remained serviceable, most biplanes built before 1937. 100 light tanks had no spare parts. Fuel stocks could last 3 months at best. Each passing week saw convoys of British transports landing fresh Allied troops at Port Sudan, while Italian fuel dumps dwindled. General Nazi strengthened Eritrea's highland forts. Gazzera guarded the Congo border. Amedeo concentrated reserves near Addis Ababa. Every commander knew the arithmetic of siege. Once ammunition and petrol were gone, there would be no rescue, no retreat, and no new supplies from Europe. On 19th January 1941, the British and Commonwealth advance began from Sudan into Eritrea. Columns of Indian infantry and Sudanese troops pushed east toward Agodat and Kareen, the mountain gateway to the interior. The defenders braced themselves for the assault that would decide the fate of Italy's African empire. For the moment, Italian East Africa stood alone, 3,000 miles from home, surrounded on all sides, commanded by men whose loyalty to Mussolini was dying as surely as the empire they had been sent to defend. Part 2. The Desert Burns, 1940 to 1941. When January 1941 arrived, the rains had ended in Eritrea, and the highlands turned brown and dry again. In the passes around Keren, the wind carried fine red dust that stung the eyes and filled rifle bolts. For months, Italian soldiers had been digging positions into those cliffs, turning the ridges into a fortress. They knew the British were coming, and they knew this battle would decide whether the empire lived another season. The first British probes reached Agodat on the 19th of January. Indian divisions from the Sudan pushed forward with Bren carriers and light artillery, testing the Italian lines. For 2 days the defenders held, then fell back toward Keren. The retreat was disciplined. The Italian generals still believed their mountain positions could hold indefinitely. From those heights, a handful of men could command the only road to Asmara and the sea. Keren soon became one of the hardest battles fought in Africa. Steep slopes, narrow valleys, and few roads made every attack costly. Italian troops, many of them Eritrean askaris, fought stubbornly from rock to rock. British and Indian battalions advanced under intense heat and shell fire, often climbing on hands and knees. The fighting lasted 7 weeks. Part 2. The Desert Burns, 1940 to 1941. When January 1941 arrived, the rains had ended in Eritrea, and the highlands turned brown and dry again. In the passes around Keren, the wind carried fine red dust that stung the eyes and filled rifle bolts. For months, Italian soldiers had been digging positions into those cliffs, turning the ridges into a fortress. They knew the British were coming, and they knew this battle would decide whether the Empire lived another season. The first British probes reached Agordat on the 19th of January. Indian divisions from the Sudan pushed forward with Bren carriers and light artillery, testing the Italian lines. For 2 days the defenders held, then fell back toward Keren. The retreat was disciplined. The Italian generals still believed their mountain positions could hold indefinitely. From those heights, a handful of men could command the only road to Asmara and the sea. Keren soon became one of the hardest battles fought in Africa. Steep slopes, narrow valleys, and few roads made every attack costly. Italian troops, many of them Eritrean askaris, fought stubbornly from rock to rock. British and Indian battalions advanced under intense heat and shell fire, often climbing on hands and knees. The fighting lasted 7 weeks. General Gazzera's southern command now stood exposed. He had roughly 40,000 men stretched along the Ethiopian frontier, facing Sudan and the Congo, cut off from both sea and air supply. His troops were a mixture of Italians, colonial askaris, and local auxiliaries. Many had not been paid in months. Disease took more soldiers than bullets. Yet Gazzera tried to keep order, convinced that surrender would bring chaos and reprisals from Ethiopian insurgents. While the Italian fronts collapsed, the Duke of Aosta still held the center, Addis Ababa and the mountain plateau around it. In early March, he ordered the evacuation of non-combatants from the capital. Hospitals moved north to Dessie. Administration files were burned. The gold reserves of the colonial treasury were buried under a guard of carabinieri. On the 6th of April, British armored cars entered Addis Ababa almost unopposed. The city's civilians looked on silently. Some cheered, others hid behind closed shutters. Prince Amedeo and what remained of his field army withdrew north to the fortress of Amba Alagi, a natural mountain bastion rising 9,000 feet above the desert. There he joined the remnants of Narsi's and Gazzera's divisions, about 7,000 men with a few artillery pieces and dwindling food. It was April 1941. In Europe, Mussolini's armies were retreating in Libya. In Africa, his dream of empire was collapsing completely. At Amba Alagi, the defenders dug in around caves and ridges. The Duke refused to abandon his troops or flee by aircraft, even when the British offered safe passage for his personal staff. He insisted he would share their fate. For a month, they endured constant bombardment from British artillery and the Royal Air Force. Water became the true enemy. Shells had cut the mountain's pipes, and every drop had to be carried by mule. On the 16th of May, after their last cistern was destroyed, Amedeo requested terms. The British accepted his surrender with honors. Major General Mayne of the 12th African Division entered the Italian lines under a white flag. The Duke of Aosta presented his sword and asked that his men be treated as soldiers, not prisoners of a defeated empire. The request was granted. For his conduct, even the British officers spoke respectfully of him. When he was sent to captivity in Kenya, he told his captors, "We fought until thirst defeated us." With Amba Alagi gone, only scattered pockets of resistance remained. Gazzera, still commanding in the southwest, refused to give up immediately. He gathered about 40,000 troops and retreated toward the forests near the Belgian-Congo border. By June, the British and Free French columns had surrounded him. Cut off from all supply and harassed by air attacks, Gazzera attempted to negotiate. He contacted Belgian officers across the frontier to ensure humane treatment for his men. On the 7th of July 1941, he surrendered with the remnants of his army. By that date, every major Italian position in East Africa had fallen. The empire Mussolini had proclaimed only 5 years earlier no longer existed. More than 250,000 Italian and colonial troops were prisoners scattered across camps in Kenya, Sudan, and India. News of the disaster reached Rome slowly. Fascist propaganda described the events as a strategic withdrawal. In private, Mussolini raged, blaming his generals for cowardice and betrayal. Yet in truth, they had done exactly what he had ordered in 1936, hold the colonies at any cost, and the cost had simply become too high. In Addis Ababa, British and Ethiopian flags rose together once more. Emperor Haile Selassie, exiled for 5 years, returned to his capital on the 5th of May, 1941. Crowds filled the streets, singing hymns of liberation. For the Ethiopians, it was the end of occupation. For Italy, it was the beginning of a reckoning. By the middle of 1941, Italy's African empire existed only in fragments of mountains and desert. The battles of Keren and Amba Alagi had destroyed its armies, and its last generals were stranded hundreds of miles from the sea. General Pietro Gazzera still commanded what remained of Italy's southern forces, about 40,000 soldiers, mostly colonial askaris, Somali auxiliaries, and Italian settlers turned refugees. Surrounded on all sides, he retreated through the jungles of southwest Ethiopia toward the Belgian Congo, hoping to surrender there under neutral protection rather than fall directly to the British. It was a march of desperation. The rains turned roads to rivers. Malaria and starvation claimed hundreds. British aircraft shadowed them, dropping leaflets promising fair treatment if they laid down their arms. On the 6th of July, 1941, Gazzera accepted reality. His men were starving, surrounded, and out of ammunition. He rode out under a white flag to meet British officers and agreed to surrender on the condition that his colonial troops be allowed to go home. He later wrote that it was not betrayal, but duty. We had no food, no bullets, and no hope of relief. To fight further was to murder our own men far to the north. Another remnant still fought on. At Gondar, General Guglielmo Nasi held around 45,000 soldiers in a ring of mountain fortresses. Cut off from supplies, they survived on dwindling rations and melted rainwater. Allied and Ethiopian forces besieged them for months, tightening the noose with each passing week. By November, starvation and disease had done more damage than gunfire. On 27th November 1941, after 10 months of isolation, Nasi surrendered. Gondar's fall ended the war in East Africa. The empire Mussolini had proclaimed 5 years earlier was gone. In less than a year, every Italian position south of the Mediterranean had fallen. More than 250,000 Italian and colonial troops were now prisoners scattered across camps in Kenya, Sudan, and India. In Italy, the fascist press disguised the loss as a strategic withdrawal. Mussolini raged privately, calling his generals cowards, but the truth was obvious. They had been ordered to hold an impossible position, cut off from all supply or support. Even many in the regime knew it. One officer wrote bitterly from captivity, "We fought with courage." Rome rewarded us with silence. The Duke of Aosta, captured at Amba Alagi, remained calm in defeat. British officers respected him for refusing to flee when escape was possible. In captivity, he told them, "We fought as soldiers until thirst defeated us." He would die of tuberculosis in Kenya the following year, his last words expressing hope that his men would be treated with dignity. For Emperor Haile Selassie, exile was over. On the 5th of May 1941, he re-entered Addis Ababa, cheered by thousands. It was the first liberation of an occupied capital during the Second World War, and it restored Africa's only independent empire. British and Ethiopian troops stood together on the same ground Italy had conquered just 5 years before. The fall of East Africa freed the Red Sea and secured Britain's lifeline to India and the Middle East, but it also shattered Mussolini's dream of imperial grandeur. From that moment onward, Italy's war was defensive, and its generals knew it. Those who had fought in Ethiopia now served in Libya and Egypt under Rommel's command. They carried with them the memory of being abandoned, the certainty that the promises from Rome meant nothing. In captivity, Gazzera and others reflected openly on that betrayal. When Allied officers asked him why the colony had collapsed, he answered simply, "Because it was forgotten." He argued that his surrender had saved lives, not dishonored Italy. Many agreed. Historians later noted that his decision spared tens of thousands of colonial troops from starvation. The betrayal that Mussolini condemned was, in truth, a quiet act of realism. His generals had not switched sides. They had simply stopped dying for a fantasy. They had seen the empire crumble, heard nothing from their government, and understood that obedience to Mussolini now meant extinction. By the end of 1941, the map of Africa had been redrawn. Italian colours vanished from the Horn, and the British line stretched unbroken from Egypt to South Africa. The soldiers of the lost empire waited behind barbed wire, wondering whether the Italy they had served would even remember them. Their story was not over. The same questions of loyalty and survival that haunted East Africa would soon return in the deserts of Libya and Tunisia, where, once again, Italian generals would be forced to decide whether to fight for Mussolini or for Italy itself. When 1942 began, the map of Africa showed Italy still clinging to one last foothold: Libya. To Mussolini, it was the front that could redeem every failure. In the deserts between Tripoli and Egypt, Italian divisions fought beside Germany's Afrika Korps under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. On paper, this alliance promised revival. In practice, it exposed the same weakness that had doomed East Africa: dependence on others for fuel, food, and leadership. The Italian army in North Africa numbered more than 200,000 men, but barely half were equipped to modern standards. Their tanks were light, their trucks worn, and their rations already short. Rommel's arrival in early 1941 had rescued them from disaster at first, pushing the British back to Egypt. Yet by 1942, even he warned Berlin that his Italian allies were exhausted. Supplies crossed the Mediterranean through a gauntlet of British submarines and aircraft from Malta. Every month that Malta remained in Allied hands, 1 ship in 3 was lost. In January 1942, Mussolini promised reinforcements, new armour, modern aircraft, and a flow of petrol without limit. None of it arrived. Italian commanders understood that their survival now depended entirely on Germany. Rommel's headquarters decided every major operation. Italian generals merely implemented orders. They still fought with courage at Gazala, Tobruk, and Mersa Matruh, but victory belonged to German planning and fuel. When praise reached Europe, Mussolini took credit. When defeats followed, he blamed his own officers. The breaking point came that autumn. After Rommel's advance stalled at El Alamein, Allied forces under General Montgomery launched the counterattack that would decide the war in the desert. For 10 days in October 1942, shells and bombs turned the Egyptian sands into a furnace. Italian divisions like Ariete and Brescia fought stubbornly, covering German withdrawals until they were annihilated. Survivors fell back across Libya in disordered columns, short of water and fuel. Rommel's dispatches praised their bravery, but made the truth plain. They had been sacrificed to buy German time. In Tripoli, Italian generals faced a dilemma they already knew too well. Rome demanded that they fight to the last man. The situation on the ground made that command suicidal. Some began to question whether continuing the war served Italy at all. One officer wrote to his wife, "We are no longer an army, only an appendix to Germany's." Among the prisoners captured later, many admitted that El Alamein had killed faith in fascism more thoroughly than any propaganda could. Through early 1943, the retreat continued across Tunisia. German units took control of ports, fuel dumps, even Italian supply columns. Field headquarters merged under German command. Italian officers were sidelined. Mussolini's telegrams arrived too late to matter. He still ordered victory or death, but his army had no means for either. By May 1943, Allied forces under General Eisenhower closed from the west, while Montgomery pressed from the east. More than 230,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, Italians, Germans, and colonial troops together. The last Italian empire on the continent ceased to exist. For the men taken prisoner, it was both relief and humiliation. In camps across Algeria and Egypt, they compared stories from East Africa and Libya and saw a single pattern: isolation, broken promises, and waste. The talk of betrayal grew louder, not betrayal of Mussolini, but betrayal by him. He had sent them to wars Italy could never sustain. The sense of deception that had begun in Addis Ababa now spread through the entire army. Back in Rome, the defeats shook the fascist regime to its core. Bombings hit the capital, food shortages worsened, and ordinary Italians no longer believed the news broadcasts. Senior officers of the Royal Army began to meet privately, asking whether loyalty to the king or to Mussolini should come first if Germany's war turned against them. Many of those officers had once served in Africa and remembered the abandonment of their comrades there. Their conclusion was clear: if saving Italy meant defying Mussolini, they would do it. In July 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily forced the question. German reinforcements poured south. Italian units deserted in groups. On the night of 24th July, the fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. The next day he was arrested on the orders of King Victor Emmanuel III. News spread through barracks and prison camps alike. For thousands of Italian soldiers, it felt like the closing of a circle. The dictator who had sent them to die in Africa was finally gone. The collapse that followed was chaotic. Germany occupied most of Italy, creating a puppet state in the north, while the new government in the south signed an armistice with the Allies. Across Africa and the Mediterranean, Italian prisoners awoke to find themselves suddenly allies of their former captors. Some volunteered to fight alongside the British in newly formed co-belligerent units. Others simply waited to go home. Historians later traced the moral break of 1943 back to the earlier disasters in Africa. Those campaigns had stripped away the illusion of fascist invincibility and taught Italian officers that blind obedience served no one. The generals who had once surrendered in Ethiopia and Libya were condemned as traitors by Mussolini, but quietly vindicated by time. Their refusal to die for empty slogans became the model that later guided Italy's decision to abandon the Axis. When the war in Africa ended, so too did Italy's last imperial dream. The colonies it had conquered at such cost were gone forever, and the empire Mussolini called eternal had lasted barely 7 years. The men who fought it remembered not triumph, but exhaustion, the feeling of standing alone under a flag that no longer meant anything. By the end of 1943, the betrayal was complete. Mussolini had betrayed his army, and his army in turn abandoned him. From that ruin, Italy would try to rebuild a different kind of honor, one no longer measured in conquered land. When the guns finally fell silent in 1943, Italy's soldiers were scattered across 3 continents. In Africa alone, more than 500,000 had fought. Barely half returned. For many, the war ended not with parades, but behind barbed wire in Allied camps that stretched from Egypt to Kenya and as far away as India. They worked on farms, built roads, and waited for a country that seemed to have forgotten them. News of Mussolini's fall reached the camps by rumor at first, then by newspapers dropped from Allied supply planes. Some men cheered, others wept quietly. Years of propaganda had promised them glory, yet what they felt now was release, the end of an ordeal that had begun with the invasion of Ethiopia. Officers who had served in East Africa told the younger prisoners that the real war had never been against Britain, but against illusion. The empire was a mirage, one wrote in his diary, and we were the dust that kept it visible. In Italy itself, the consequences of the African campaigns ran deep. The defeats had shattered fascism's claim to efficiency and military genius long before Allied troops landed on the peninsula. The public knew that entire armies had vanished into captivity, that no victory had followed the grand speeches. For the monarchy and the army, Africa became proof that Mussolini's leadership could bring only ruin. It helped make the decision to depose him possible. After the armistice of September 1943, many former prisoners volunteered for service with the Allies. In North Africa, the British formed Italian co-belligerent units drawn from those who had once fought against them. These men, mechanics, drivers, engineers, now helped maintain the Allied advance into Europe. It was a small redemption, but for many it felt like a chance to fight for Italy rather than for fascism. Others never returned. The Duke of Aosta's grave remained in Kenya, cared for by local workers who had respected him even in defeat. Pietro Gazzera lived quietly after the war, writing a memoir that described the surrender at Jimma not as disgrace, but as salvation. He argued that real courage sometimes meant refusing to die for lies. His book was little read in Italy at the time. Only decades later did historians recognize its candor. For Ethiopia, the legacy was different, but equally lasting. The defeat of Italy in 1941 restored independence and inspired a generation of Africans who saw that colonial empires could be broken. Ethiopian troops who had fought beside the British carried those memories into the post-war years. When independence movements later spread across the continent, they often cited Ethiopia's victory as proof that foreign domination was not inevitable. In Rome, The reckoning came slowly. The post-war government faced the loss of every overseas possession. Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia were stripped from Italian control. The colonial ministry was dissolved. For ordinary Italians, it was the end of an era, though few mourned it. The dream of empire had promised prosperity, but delivered graves scattered across deserts and mountains. What survived was guilt, silence, and a determination never again to follow a dictator into imperial adventure. The men who had once been called traitors were quietly rehabilitated. Gazzera's decision to surrender rather than see his army starve became an example in military ethics courses. Even the British official history of the East African campaign noted the professionalism of the Italian commanders once cut off from Rome. Their actions, it said, were guided by humanity as much as by duty. In Italy's new republic, founded in 1946, remembrance of the African War was subdued. Veterans' associations met privately. Films and textbooks avoided the subject. The story did not fit the narrative of national renewal. Yet in the archives, letters and diaries from those years preserved another truth: the moment when loyalty to a regime gave way to loyalty to conscience. It was there, many argued later, that the moral rebirth of Italy began. For historians, the collapse of the African empire remains a study in limits. It shows how ambition without logistics, ideology without realism, and pride without empathy can destroy a nation's credibility. It also shows that individual decency can survive within systems built on deception. The Italian generals who surrendered in Africa did not save an empire, but they saved thousands of lives and perhaps helped Italy rediscover its soul. Today, the remnants of those campaigns lie quiet. Rusted artillery pieces dot the Eritrean highlands. Trenches near Keren fill with grass after the rains. In Ethiopia, villagers still find badges and helmets buried under their fields. Each object speaks of a war fought far from Europe's attention, where courage and futility mixed in equal measure. The monuments to the Duke of Aosta and to Ethiopian and African soldiers who opposed him stand only a few miles apart, a reminder that dignity existed on both sides of a senseless struggle. The story that began with Mussolini's boast of a new Roman Empire ended with generals laying down their arms to save their men. It ended with the fall of a dictator and the fading of the last European empire in Africa. And it left behind a lesson that outlived the century, that real strength is not measured by conquest, but by the moment a nation learns to stop believing in its own lies.